Hi, David Hazeltine here to talk about the quintessential elements of bebop. I've divided my talk into two parts. The first part will deal with melodic devices and combining these devices into the grammar or language of bebop. And the second part will deal with exercises to facilitate practicing this grammar and also the harmony and harmonic accompaniment to the exercises or the practicing of the language. First and foremost, we have scales, and very important, the idea of scales as a connecting device to connect all the other melodic devices. There are many different kinds of scales. I can't possibly talk about all of the different scales available to us in this short video, but I'll cover the major ones. Before I talk about the scales, though, I want to emphasize the importance of realizing the relationship between the 2 and the 5 chord. 2 5s form a very special relationship. So when you talk about 2 5s, for example, in the key of C, the 2 chord is D minor, the 5 chord is G7. So if you were playing scale tone 7s, we're talking about these 2 chords. And essentially, the real difference between these 2 chords is one note. It's the C. In D minor, the C is moving to B in the G7. So these are relationships that it's very important to understand and to memorize and to be comfortable with, because everything basically that you play over a 5 chord, you can play over a 2 chord or a 2 5. That's why we talk about them in pairs, 2 5s, even without the 1. So in other words, D minor 7 to G7 to C major is a 2 5 1 in the key of C, but many times in jazz we talk about just 2 5s without the 1. So 2 5, D minor G7, E flat minor, A flat 7, E minor A7. This is all very important stuff to memorize. Okay, so now the scale types, particular scale types involved in bebop. First and foremost, we have the 8-note scale as opposed to the 7-note scale that most people know. So most people consider this scale like in the key of C. Which is fine. It's a great scale, and everyone should know those scales, backwards and forwards. The problem is, when we're improvising music, we want to sound the chords without any chords being played in the background. And the only way to do that, jazz is usually played in 8th notes. So 8th notes, if you think about it, there are 8 8th notes in a bar, a 4/4 time, 8 8th notes in a bar. So what we want to do to sound the chord is to play the chord tones on the downbeats and the non-chord tones on the upbeats. So the passing chord tones on the upbeats, chord tones on the downbeats. And that's impossible to do with a 7-note scale. So that's why in bebop, we make it an 8-note scale. So for example, C dominant, we play, instead of, we add the major 7th. You see, so 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. So that half step is what gives us that sound of the dominant chord. All right, so just like the dominant chord, we do the same thing for major chords. We play the half step between the 6 and the 5. Half step between the root and the 7th is in the dominant chord. In the major chord, the half step is between the 6 and the 5. Okay? We also have the altered dominant chord. So, in other words, instead of just a plain dominant, we have the alternate dominant. So a plain dominant chord sounds like this. Altered dominant might sound like this. So in that case we have, it's like the dominant scale, except with a flat 6 and a flat 9. So we have, this is especially effective when moving to a minor chord, when 1 is a minor chord. So, okay, so we have the bebop scale, the dominant bebop scale, the altered dominant bebop scale, and we have the bebop major scale. Of course, it's important that you learn these scales in all the keys. So, and so on and so forth with each kind of scale. That particular scale is a descending scale typically. So when we're talking about these half-step scales, it's typically a descending scale. So another scale, I refer to it as the Dorian mode scale or the minor scale. So on a minor chord, still in the key of C, we have D minor 7, and we're talking about, it's a C major scale played from D to D. Most often you hear this scale played like this. So that's the scale, but okay, so that's the Dorian scale. Then you have the diminished scale. So D diminished would sound like this. So it's whole step, half step, whole step, half step. D, E, F. Okay? These scales are very useful in terms of not only diminished chords, but also in terms of dominant chords. And the dominant chords are always a half step away from any of the diminished chords. So, first of all, you have to understand that diminished chords, there are only 3 actual diminished chords. If you look at the way diminished chords are formed, they're all minor third intervals. It's a very interesting chord. No other chord is like it. The same exact interval between each note of the chord. So there's D diminished, E flat diminished, E diminished, and then when you get to F diminished, it's the same thing as D diminished. It's just an inversion. You know, it's just a different note on the bottom. So there are only 3 different combinations of notes making up the diminished chords. So that makes the diminished scale, you know, easy to learn, you know, but you have to learn it, you have to be able to play it from any point. So you hear things like, right? But another use of the diminished, and probably the most common use of the diminished scale, is in terms of the dominant flat 9 sound, or the altered dominant sound. So the diminished scale with the root lowered a half step makes it a dominant chord. So in other words, D diminished is the scale that you would play over D flat 7. You know, so when you have a dominant chord, you can think a half step up and play that diminished scale. So let's say we have D flat dominant. Now you think a half step up, that's D diminished. If that's making the sound of D flat 7, flat 9. Going to F sharp minor or G flat minor. So D7 would be E flat diminished. Going to G minor. Okay, so there's a very special relationship between the diminished chord or the diminished scale and the dominant altered scale or the dominant altered chord, especially as it's the 5 of 1 minor, or 5 of any kind of minor chord. So G7 going to C minor, you would want to use a G7 altered scale, which means A flat diminished. If you wanted to go to F minor, you would use C altered dominant, which would be D flat diminished. All right, so that's the diminished scale. We have the whole tone scale. Very simple. It's all whole tones. You can hear that in a lot of Monk's music. Let me see. An example would be perfect example, like almost a pianistic flourish he uses over B flat 7. He plays a B flat whole tone scale. Okay, so there's the whole tone scale, and then there's the combination of whole tone and diminished scale, and it's called the diminished whole tone scale. And it's very similar, or actually, it's exactly like the melodic minor scale. It's a very convenient and universal scale. It sounds like this. But what happens is, because that's a 7-note scale, instead of adding an extra note, most often we eliminate one note, so it becomes a 6-note scale. So you hear this. So we're eliminating this note. And the reason why this scale is so useful is it articulates so many different kinds of chords. For example, this one scale, one way I think of this scale is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 in the key of C, and then the flat 6, and then it repeats itself. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, flat 6. So that scale can articulate C major, right? It can articulate F minor. It can articulate B flat 7. It can articulate E7 altered, like an E7 sharp 9. Right? So, the diminished whole tone scale is a great universal scale. One of my favorite tenor saxophone players, Hank Mobley, makes great use of the diminished whole tone scale in all of the different harmonic contexts. So it's a very useful scale. So anyway, as I said before, there are many, many different kinds of scales that one can practice, but I think these are the main ones that we look at in bebop. Now I want to talk about scale shapes, little things that we do to the scale. So let's say we're talking about a C major scale. you know, there's all sorts of things we can do to the scale to change the shape. So in other words, you see, or we're just taking a major scale and changing the shape. Instead of playing, we're making a pattern and then taking it up or down from each degree. Or then you have like zigzag, I call them zigzag shapes. So right? So back and forth kind of shape. And then we have special shapes that apply to, especially diminished scales, have interesting shapes that apply. For example, there are some standard patterns like, this is the diminished scale. So one way you can look at this descending diminished scale from C is it's C7, like a C mixolydian scale, then F sharp mixolydian scale. So it's the tritone, C mixolydian, F sharp mixolydian, then the C mixolydian, F sharp mixolydian. So now the shape is, but it's using the same notes of the scale, just in different configurations. Another common one is okay. So these are different scale shapes. So of the devices, the second device I want to talk about are the arpeggios. Arpeggios. So we have scales, arpeggios. In classical music, we always talk about practice your scales and arpeggios. In jazz, it's the same thing. Arpeggios make up a good percentage of the vocabulary. So by arpeggios, I mean starting with three-note arpeggios. Well, even in the major realm, like C major, those would be considered arpeggios. Ascending or descending. It's a good idea to know them in every key. So our three-note arpeggios, and then we have four-note arpeggios, which are the most common. So we have major arpeggios from the third, from the seventh, that's a good exercise. Stringing together the arpeggios. We have those same arpeggios descending. Then we have dominant arpeggios, which means considering the 2 chord and the 5 chord. So for D minor 7, G7, we have D minor from the root, or from the 9th, or from the 3rd, and then G7 from the 3rd. So oftentimes those arpeggios are connected, like okay. We also have inversions of the arpeggios. For example, the dominant arpeggio, G7, starting from the third, you'd play the third up an octave and then play the rest of the notes in the same position. So instead of this, you play. So you see, for a saxophone player, it's the same. They play the same notes, but they play the octave key on the first one. Or for the minor chord, like this arpeggio would be. So those are two inverted arpeggios. Okay? So arpeggios, inversions of arpeggios. Another device that is very typical in bebop music is the device of appoggiaturas. Appoggiaturas are very old. You hear it in Mozart. You hear it in all classical music. It's circling the chord tone before playing the chord tone. So, for example, the chord G7, the chord tones we're circling are the flat 7, the 5th, and the 3rd. And we do it like this. Classical composers refer to this as ornamentation, really, but it's appoggiatura. These are appoggiatura figures. So it's a way to change the direction of the line, to add interest to the line. In a scale, normally you'd play a jazz scale, like using the bebop scale. Embellished with appoggiaturas, it might be. See, so it adds interest in terms of changing the shape of the line. So appoggiaturas, and then we have resolutions to the chord tones. So the chord tones, for example, in a dominant chord, G7, we have a resolution. It's very similar to an appoggiatura, but I call them resolutions to chord tones because they follow a very specific pattern. It's a half step up from the point of arrival, or the resolution tone, and then chromatically up from a whole step below. So it's 4 notes, the 4th note being the actual tone you want to arrive at. And so those are resolutions to the chord tones. Okay? Then we have the miscellaneous kinds of shapes. And one of the predominant ones, predominant shapes are like things that come from Hanon exercises, various classical exercises, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 patterns, especially in minor keys. But remember, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 patterns in minor apply to the dominant a fourth above because of the 2-5 relationship. So, for example, a D minor 7, we have, that's D minor, but the same thing applies to G7 because that's a 2-5. So, and so on and so forth. Then we have, more specifically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 1. So that sounds like. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 1. We can have the left-hand chord stay the same, D minor. Or we can change to 2-5. Or we can just play dominant. And then we have different patterns with just the 5, 5-3-2-1, or different arrangements of that, like 5-3-2-1 or 3-5-2-1. So here's 5-3-2-1, D minor, and 3-5-2-1 is. So there's a combination of all of them. It's just dealing with these 5 notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the minor chord. But the same applies to the dominant chord, but in the minor context. And so on. And so, for example, in major chords, we have 3-5-2-1 from the third of the major chord, and then we do the same thing from the seventh. And then we also have the same thing, making it minor. So C minor, all we do is flat the third. Same thing though. And so on. Using 16th notes, the da-da-da, or triplets, ba-da-ba-da-ba, you know, to vary the sound of the scales or arpeggios. So, for example, we use triplets at arpeggios. Instead of playing, we go, so the triplets hidden in the middle. So the triplets embedded in it, ba-da-ba-da-da, ba-da-da-da-da, right? So it's usually started with a rest, an eighth note, then the triplet. So 1, and then here's the triplet. 1. Okay? And then the 16th notes, either groups of 2 or 4 16th notes. So let's say you're playing the bebop scale in the dominant chord. So we can vary that by using 4 16th notes and going. Right? That's 4 16ths. So 1 E and a 2. Or 2 note 16th groupings, which would sound like. So you have 4 note 16th note groupings, 2 note 16th note groupings, but it puts a little break in the line. You know, da 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 da. Okay? So now I'd like to talk about the grammar of bebop, and I like to make this association, you know, the similarity in the language of jazz, the language of bebop, to foreign language, learning a foreign language, and the best way to learn or think of even learning the language of jazz and bebop. And I say jazz and bebop. Bebop can be thought of as the underlying language or rules of all modern jazz. And in fact, you know, it's been said that, you know, players that only play in a modern sense and don't understand the tenets of bebop really kind of lack something about the language. And that's because it has to do with being articulate in this language of bebop. And you can see by even the things I've talked about so far how this could be so. It's complicated, and when learning this language of bebop, you really learn how to get around and all the different melodic devices, which are not emphasized necessarily in more modern playing, but which can guide modern playing into some very hip ideas. For example, the very modern player Chick Corea, one of his idols as he was coming up, besides Charlie Parker and the usual, but he was a big fan of Red Garland. And when you listen to Red Garland play piano and then listen to Chick Corea, especially in later years, you might say, "Wow, I don't hear any similarities." But Chick Corea was, recording for Blue Note and recording with great jazz musicians in the '60s in very typical post-bop kind of groups, you can hear the influence at that point, and that very much directed him to the next level of his musical development. So, the grammar of bebop is very important. These devices need to be put together or structured in such a way that they make sense. You can't just mix these things together and expect it to sound great. So it's got to be put together in a certain way, just like in language. You can't just throw words into a sentence and expect it to make sense. It has to follow some kind of rules, some kind of logic. So the only way for us to understand how to do this in jazz is to look at the way people have played. And the way to do that is through solo transcription. So this is a very arduous process, and these days you can buy solo transcriptions. I recommend that you do it yourself, because in the process of transcribing you learn so much more and you develop your ears in a way that's very important when you're playing, and it informs your subconscious, it informs your consciousness. Otherwise, you're just reading things off of a piece of paper, and it's really not sinking in the same way. So, transcribing solos are very important. And also, I recommend when you do that, that you memorize it, that you don't write things down, that you memorize at the time that you're transcribing. Maybe later you can write it down, so that you have a record of it, so that, as you accumulate these solos, you can go, there's too many things to remember. You can go back and revisit some things in the future. But it's part of the process to remember everything and to focus on, once you have the right notes, to focus on getting the touch and the right dynamics together. So, but what we're talking about now really is about how to put the devices together in such a way that it sounds like the actual music, as opposed to a science project. So the way I look at this thing is very much from player to player, and so it's really a matter of style, especially with pianists. I'm sure it's the same with other instruments as well, but in piano, we have so many different piano styles, so many different outlooks on the thing. So as a very young student, when you're trying to learn how to do this, it's very helpful to find a person to focus on, try to understand what they're doing, and try to assimilate their style into your own, and then move on and go to another model. So you have these models, just like a child learning a language, a 2-year-old child. He's looking at all these people talking around him, and he's kind of taking it all in and figuring out how to put the language together. We're adults, so we're not being children, but we can kind of use the same process, but it's to our benefit to try to arrange it in a certain way, try to be analytical about our approach to viewing this language. So I recommend looking at one individual player at a time when doing these solo transcriptions. Now, obviously, the more players you look at, the better off you are in terms of it's easier to identify the common vocabulary. You know, like if you're trying to figure out how am I going to fit into the jazz idiom, you know, it's easier if you kind of have a generalized sense of the language. That's how I always approached it. And so the more players you look at, the more you find common ground, the more you see what the common language is. It's kind of like a puzzle. You're putting together a puzzle. You're trying to figure out how to speak this language. So, and looking at, you know, the more players you look at, it widens your vocabulary. It gives you more and more things to draw from that you can express your, you know, different ways to express yourself. When you start to do this, you transcribe the solos, and then you have to look at the solos and analyze these solos. And you have to identify the vocabulary that the player you're studying uses most often. So what is, you know, how does this guy play over G7, you know, or any dominant chord or any major chord? Like, what are the things that he does most often? And you try to do that in the shortest possible phrases, because when you think about a guy improvising, he's combining things in a lot of different ways, just like someone making a speech might put words together in several different ways and might make the same speech to different audiences, but it's going to sound different each time because they're going to be thinking of a point but be ordering their words in a different way. So in jazz, people are having devices that they want to use, but it's rather arbitrary in how they put the devices together. So it's important to try to get it down to the smallest, in an analytical way, it's important to get it down to the smallest possible units. I like to talk about pitch rhythms. And by pitch rhythms, I mean, you know, when you listen to a scale, there's no rhythm in that scale. I mean, the only rhythm is that it's eighth notes. You know, but if I change direction in the line, every time I change the direction of the line, it suggests a rhythm, you know, and that is part of what creates the interest in a jazz line, in a typical, you know, line. So a typical line is, you know, it's got all sorts of ups and downs and different shapings, and even though it's all eighth notes being played like that, still there's a rhythm suggested by the different pitch, and that's why I call it pitch rhythms. So here are the 8 different kinds of pitch rhythms. Straight up, straight down. Here's the quick up and then prolonged down. Then there's the prolonged up, ascending, and then quick descent. So that's 4. Then just the opposite way, there's the quick descent and ascending, and then long descent, quick ascending, and then the 2 zigzag patterns, do, be, and then be, boo, dee, da. And that basically is all the different directions that a 4-note phrase can take. It's very helpful to identify these kind of shapes in a person's solos. And so what I recommend is transcribing at least 3 or 4 or 5, the more the better, but you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 solos of a certain person, you know, a particular person, model, and then to look at it analytically and figure out these kinds of shapes. And then in the next section, I'm going to get into how to design exercises to facilitate your learning the language of bebop. One of the things about making your own jazz exercises is that you're actually practicing something that you're going to use in your performance, in your playing, in your improvising. A tonic minor exercise based on the style of Finest Newborn. Like early 60s McCoy Tyner style. So the F7 can be broken up into C minor F7. So in jazz, we sort of have a clave, especially for pianists or for rhythm section players. You're practicing your technique while practicing things that you're going to play. This gives you some ideas about what to play on a blues at a slow tempo when you play 16th notes.